Every culture on Earth, separated by oceans, mountains, and thousands of years, tells the same impossible story. A story about beings who came down from the sky or up from the waters and mixed their blood with ordinary humans. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The Hebrews called them the sons of God. The Greeks called them titans and gods who fathered heroes. The Egyptians spoke of the followers of Horus ruling before the first pharaohs even existed. 9 civilizations, 9 bloodlines, all describing the same core idea, that somewhere in the deep past, something not entirely human helped shape who we became. Here's what should keep you up at night. Except tonight we're using it to help you sleep. These cultures had no contact with each other. The Maya in Mesoamerica and the Sumerians in Mesopotamia were separated by an entire ocean and thousands of years. The Chinese dynastic myths and the Polynesian skyfather legends developed on opposite sides of the planet, with 0 shared trade routes, 0 shared language, 0 possible way to copy from one another. And yet, when you lay their origin stories side by side, the parallels are staggering. Divine or semi-divine ancestors, kings who ruled for impossibly long lifespans, hybrid children born from unions between gods and mortals, great floods that wiped out nearly everyone except a chosen few who carried forward a special bloodline. Coincidence, maybe? Shared human psychology, dreaming up similar answers to the same unanswerable questions? Possibly. Or maybe, just maybe, there's something else going on here. Something buried in humanity's collective memory that keeps resurfacing in myth after myth after myth, dynasty after dynasty, continent after continent. Tonight we're going to travel through 9 of these ancient, non-human bloodlines. From the antediluvian kings of Sumer who supposedly ruled for tens of thousands of years, to the Nephilim of Genesis, to the demigod heroes of Greece, all the way to the sky and earth ancestors of Polynesia. We'll explore where these stories came from, what they might really mean, and why they keep echoing across cultures that should have never known about each other at all. If you're settling in to drift off tonight, that's exactly what this is for. So subscribe if you'd like, and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love seeing it. Tokyo at midnight, London at tea time, all reading the same ancient mysteries together. If you'd rather listen without any music or ads interrupting your sleep, follow along on Spotify, links in the description. And if these stories help you drift off, a 5-star review is the best way to support the channel. Now, let's go back to the very beginning. Sumer, the world's first kingdom, and a list of kings who supposedly ruled before the flood. Item 1 takes us to the muddy banks of the Euphrates River, sometime around 4,000 years ago, to a civilization that was busy inventing writing, inventing cities, inventing the very concept of kingship itself. This is Sumer, the place where human history, as far as written records go, actually begins, and buried within their clay tablets is a document that has puzzled scholars for over a century. It's called the Sumerian King List, and it might be the strangest historical record ever created. Picture this. You're a scribe in ancient Mesopotamia, pressing a stylus into wet clay, recording the names of kings who ruled your land. This is normal work. Every civilization keeps records of its rulers. But then you get to the beginning of your list, the very first kings who supposedly ruled before a great flood swept across the land, and something strange happens to the numbers. The first king, a man named Allulim, ruling from the city of Eridu, is credited with a reign of 28,800 years. Not a typo, not a mistranslation. 28,800 years for a single human lifetime on the throne. His successor, a king named Allogar, supposedly ruled for 36,000 years. And it just keeps going from there, city after city, king after king, with reign lengths that stretch into numbers so vast they become almost meaningless to the human mind. By the time you add up all 8 or 10 kings who ruled in this list before the flood arrives and washes everything away, you're looking at a combined reign length of over 241,000 years. Now, if you're lying there right now trying to picture what 241,000 years even means, don't worry. That's exactly the reaction scholars have had since this list was first translated in the 1900s. To put it in perspective, recorded human civilization, as we currently understand it, only stretches back about 6,000 years. So the Antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list is claiming a span of time roughly 40 times longer than all of recorded history combined, and attributing it to a handful of named individuals ruling from a handful of named cities. These weren't myths presented as myths either. This is what makes the king list so strange. It's formatted exactly like a normal historical record. It reads the same way you'd expect a list of Egyptian pharaohs or Roman emperors to read. City, king, number of years, next king, next number of years, until eventually you reach the line that changes everything. Then the flood swept over the land, and after the flood had swept over the land, and when kingship was lowered again from heaven, that single phrase is doing an enormous amount of work. Kingship lowered again from heaven, not established by human agreement, not seized through conquest, not inherited through ordinary bloodlines. Lowered as if kingship itself was a divine object, a kind of technology or gift handed down from somewhere above and given specifically to certain individuals. And after the flood, once kingship descends again, the reign lengths in the list drop dramatically. Still exaggerated by modern standards, still counting reigns in the hundreds or low thousands of years, but nowhere close to the almost cosmic numbers attributed to the kings who came before the Great Flood. It's like something changed, like whatever conditions allowed those first rulers to live and reign for tens of thousands of years simply stopped existing once the waters receded. So who exactly were these antediluvian kings, and why does the list treat them so differently from every ruler who came after? This is where we start wading into territory that gets a lot more speculative, and honestly a lot more fascinating depending on how deep you're willing to go. Because in Sumerian religious texts outside the king list, in hymns, in mythological narratives, in temple inscriptions, there's a recurring group of divine or semi-divine beings called the Anunnaki. The name roughly translates to something like those of royal blood, or offspring of Enen, referring to Enen, the Sumerian sky god, who sat at the very top of their pantheon. In the original Sumerian and later Akkadian and Babylonian texts, the Anunnaki are described as powerful deities, gods who govern the earth, the underworld, fertility, justice, and fate. They weren't distant, abstract forces either. Sumerian mythology describes them actively intervening in human affairs, assigning kingship, granting wisdom, and in several accounts directly fathering or mentoring the earliest rulers of the land. Here's where things get interesting for our purposes tonight. Several ancient Mesopotamian texts, including portions of what scholars call the Sumerian creation and flood narratives, describe the Anunnaki as being intimately connected to the establishment of kingship on Earth. In some versions, it's the god Enki who advises humanity and helps preserve knowledge through the flood. In others, it's An himself who decides which cities and which rulers deserve the gift of kingship. The antediluvian kings on that famous list, the ones ruling for tens of thousands of years, weren't necessarily portrayed as regular humans who happened to live absurdly long lives. In the broader mythological context, some interpretations suggest they were understood as beings closer to the divine, rulers whose long reigns were possible precisely because their bloodlines were tied to or blessed by the Anunnaki themselves. Now, in the last 100 years or so, this connection between the antediluvian kings and the Anunnaki has taken on a life far beyond what ancient Mesopotamian scribes probably ever intended. Starting in the mid-20th century, a popular theory began to emerge, largely through the writings of authors like Zecharia Sitchin, suggesting that the Anunnaki weren't gods in the metaphorical or religious sense at all. According to this theory, the Anunnaki were literal beings from another world, an advanced species that travelled to Earth in the deep past, and the Antediluvian kings on the Sumerian king list were either these beings themselves ruling directly over early human settlements, or hybrid offspring born from unions between the Anunnaki and early humans. Under this interpretation, the impossibly long reign lengths suddenly make a strange kind of sense. If these kings weren't fully human, if they carried some kind of extended lifespan inherited from a non-human bloodline, then maybe 28,800 years isn't a scribal error or a symbolic number at all. Maybe it's simply describing exactly what it says. A being whose biology functioned on a completely different timescale than ordinary humans. This idea has exploded in popularity across documentaries, books, and online communities over the past several decades, weaving the Anunnaki into a much larger tapestry of ancient astronaut theory. The idea that many of humanity's earliest myths about gods descending from the sky are actually distorted folk memories of contact with extraterrestrial or otherwise non-human visitors. Under this framework, Sumer becomes ground zero for humanity's first recorded encounter with something not entirely of this world, and the king list becomes not myth, but a genealogical record, however garbled by thousands of years of retelling, of an actual non-human bloodline that once ruled over the earliest cities on Earth. It's worth pausing here and just sitting with how strange and how compelling that idea is. A civilization independently invents writing, invents the concept of recorded history, and one of the very first things they choose to write down is a list of kings connected to gods, kings whose reigns stretch into numbers so vast they dwarf all of subsequent human history, followed immediately by a catastrophic flood that wipes the slate clean and starts everything over. Whether you find the extraterrestrial interpretation convincing or find it a step too far into speculation, there's no denying that the Sumerians themselves seemed absolutely certain that something extraordinary, something not entirely human in origin, was present at the very dawn of kingship itself. But if we set the more dramatic interpretations aside for a moment and move into the quiet world of philologists, epigraphers, and historians, a different kind of explanation appears. Less cinematic maybe, but in its own way just as strange. Because from a historian's point of view, the most pressing question isn't, could anyone live 36,000 years? It's, what were the Sumerians trying to say by writing numbers like that in the first place? Ancient scribes were not fools. They were trained specialists operating in temple schools, copying canonical texts, memorizing lists of signs, numbers, deities, cities. They knew perfectly well how long an ordinary human life lasted. We have plenty of economic tablets, contracts, and legal records that use completely realistic time spans. 1 year, 3 years, 10 years. So why in this one genre of text do the numbers suddenly jump into the tens of thousands? One of the most common scholarly suggestions is that those huge reign lengths aren't meant to be read as literal lifespans at all, but as symbolic or mathematical constructions. In other words, the numbers themselves are doing theology. When researchers look closely at the Antediluvian section of the king list, they notice that the reign lengths tend to be built from repeating numerical patterns. Many of them are multiples of 60, 600, or 3,600. That's not random. The Sumerians and later Babylonians used a sexagesimal system, a base 60 mathematics, where 60 played a role somewhat similar to how 10 does in our decimal system. 60, 600, 3,600. These were deeply meaningful units woven into their ways of measuring time, angles, and celestial cycles. So, when a king like Alalgar is said to have ruled for 36,000 years, Some historians think we're not looking at a casual exaggeration. We're looking at 10 times 3,600, a neat, rounded, absolutely enormous number that signals something like perfection, completeness, or cosmic scale. The rain is being aligned with the movements of the heavens, not the beating of a human heart. Under this view, the antediluvian kings belong to a different category of time altogether. They don't live in what later Mesopotamians would consider ordinary historical time. They live in what scholars sometimes call mythic time, or primordial time, a kind of stretched, luminous era at the edge of memory, where years behave more like symbols than like calendar entries. You can hear a faint echo of this in many other cultures. In early Chinese sources, the first sage kings rule for impossibly long spans. In Indian Puranic texts, the ages of the world are measured in yugas lasting hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. In the Hebrew Bible, pre-flood patriarchs like Methuselah are credited with long, strange lifespans that taper off after the flood. Again and again, the deep past is marked by lives and reigns that stretch far beyond our sense of what is biologically plausible. Historians, looking across traditions, tend to see a pattern. As societies begin to write their histories, they often push the dawn of kingship and culture back into a sacred zone of elongated time. Gigantic numbers become a way of saying, this was not like now. This was other. This was closer to the gods. So when the king list tells you that a particular ruler reigned for 28,800 years, it may not be asking you to do the math. It may be asking you to feel the distance, to sense that these names belong to a category of being that is qualitatively different from the city rulers who come later, paying wages in barley and silver, arguing over canals and boundary stones. There's another layer to this as well, and it has to do with legitimacy. The king list was not just a neutral chronicle, it was composed, edited, and recopied over centuries in different cities that were often competing with each other. Each time a new dynasty rose to prominence, scribes had an incentive to stitch that dynasty into the grand story of kingship, stretching back before the flood. One way to do that is to create an unbroken line. Kingship descended from heaven to Eridu, then moved to other cities, then after the flood it came here, to us. By anchoring your current ruler at the end of a list that begins in the hazy God-touched world before the deluge, you transform a local political fact into a cosmic inevitability. The absurdly long reign lengths of the earliest kings act like massive pillars at the far end of the hall, holding up the entire structure of royal ideology. Some scholars suggest that the dramatic shortening of reigns after the flood is itself part of this ideological storytelling. Before the deluge, timeless, nearly immortal rulers associated with divine favour. After the deluge, still special, still blessed kings, but now firmly inside human limits. Heaven has stepped back a little. Kingship is still lowered from heaven, but it operates through fragile mortal bodies. In this sense, the king list may be mapping a kind of slow withdrawal of the divine from everyday governance. The further you move from the flood, the more kings look like us. Their reigns become counted in human-sized segments. Their struggles and defeats are recorded. Eventually, later tablets stop bothering with grand mythic spans at all, and focus entirely on historical rulers whose existence we can corroborate through archaeology and contemporary inscriptions. Another, more technical possibility sometimes discussed is that the crazy numbers might reflect the transformation of older, non-year units into years by later scribes. Maybe an earlier tradition counted reigns in months, or in some ritual cycle, and a copyist centuries later, working with a damaged or misunderstood source, converted those counts into years without realizing he was inflating everything by a factor of 12 or 60. There's no consensus on this, but it's part of the toolkit scholars use. checking whether numerical absurdity might be the fossil of a lost counting system. Across all these explanations, symbolic math, mythic time, political propaganda, scribal conversion errors, one thing remains clear. The exaggeration is not random, the numbers are not lazy. They're part of a carefully constructed narrative about how power enters the human world, how close that power once was to the realm of the gods, and how it has been slowly, steadily humanized. And that brings us back, gently, to the theme that will keep surfacing throughout the rest of the night. Again and again, cultures remember a time when rulership, wisdom, or blood itself seemed to come from somewhere other than ordinary humanity. Sometimes those memories are dressed as gods like the Anunnaki. Sometimes as patriarchs, demigods, dragon-born sages, sky-earth children. Sometimes they're encoded not in elaborate myths at all, but in bare lists of names and numbers. The Sumerian king list just happens to be one of the earliest and starkest examples. A simple sequence of lines on clay, quietly insisting that before history as we know it, before cities as we recognize them, there was a line of rulers whose very lifespans told you they were not quite like us. As you drift a little deeper into the story, hold that pattern in the back of your mind, because the Sumerians were not the only ones to remember a time when kingship, or something very much like it, was lowered from somewhere else. 2 Genesis Nephilim, sons of God and human women, the Sumerians, looking back toward their own beginnings, spoke of kingship descending from heaven. The Hebrews, writing much later, preserved something that feels like a shadow twin of that idea. Not a king list this time, but a brief, unsettling interruption in the early chapters of Genesis. A few lines that seem to crack open the ordinary human story and let something older, stranger, leak through. You find it right before the flood narrative, almost as if it's the last rumour of a previous age. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. The text is short enough that entire libraries have been built on top of it. It begins quietly, when human beings began to multiply on the face of the ground and daughters were born to them. Nothing supernatural yet, just a sense of population increase, of humanity filling the earth. Then the shift comes. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves whomever they chose. Already the vocabulary is doing something strange. 2 categories are set side by side. On one hand, daughters of men, ordinary mortal women. On the other, sons of God, beings whose exact identity the text refuses to explain. The verb is simple and physical. They saw and they took. The boundaries between categories blur in an almost casual way. In the next line, the tone tightens. God speaks, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. It's as if this crossing of lines triggers a kind of divine recoil, a decision to impose limits. In the Sumerian king list, the ages of rulers shrink after the flood. Here, something similar happens in reverse order. First, the warning about shortened human lifespan, then the flood story. Between those two, the Nephilim appear. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men that were of old men of renown. That's it. No origin story, no detailed description, no list of names. Just a statement that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward, tied directly to the unions between sons of God and human women, and a brief characterization. The mighty men that were of old, men of renown. The Hebrew term Nephilim is rare. It shows up here, and then again much later in the book of Numbers, when Israelite spies describe the terrifying inhabitants of Canaan as giants, and add, "We saw the Nephilim there, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes." Already, centuries apart within the biblical narrative, the word carries an aura of size, power, and fear. Linguistically, no one is entirely sure what Nephilim means. Many older translations rendered it as giants, following ancient Greek versions of the text that used the word gigantes. Some scholars think it might be related to a Hebrew root meaning to fall and read it as fallen ones. Others suggest nuances like those who cause others to fall, as in mighty warriors who make enemies fall in battle. The text itself never pauses to clarify. It simply assumes that the reader already knows who the Nephilim are. That assumption is interesting. It hints that by the time Genesis took the form we have, stories about these beings were probably already circulating. The author can afford to be vague because the cultural background is doing the heavy lifting. We get a glimpse of that background when we step outside the Bible into the literature of the Second Temple period, roughly the last few centuries before the Common Era and the first century of it. Jewish writers in this era, working under Persian, then Greek, then Roman empires, began to expand on the tantalizing gaps in their ancient scriptures. The most famous of these expansions is 1 Enoch, a composite work attributed to the antediluvian patriarch Enoch, the seventh from Adam. It didn't make it into the later Jewish or most Christian canons, but it was hugely influential in its time, and it takes the tiny Genesis 6 passage and unfolds it into an elaborate myth. In 1 Enoch, the sons of God become watchers, a group of heavenly beings often counted as 200, who stand on the boundary between the divine realm and the human world. The story begins with them looking down from their high station and desiring human women. Their leader, a figure named Semyaza, hesitates. He fears that if they go through with their plan, he alone will bear the guilt. The others swear oaths together on a mountain, binding themselves to the transgression as a group. Then they descend. Once again, the verbs are simple. They see, they take, they lie with. But 1 Enoch adds details that Genesis only implies. The Watchers not only father children with human women, they also teach humanity forbidden knowledge. Specific names are attached to specific arts. One reveals metalworking and weapons, another cosmetics and adornment, another enchantments, astrology, the reading of the stars, technology, beauty, divination, warfare, all poured into the human world from beings who were supposed to watch, not interfere. The children born from these unions are described as gigantic, ravenous, and violent. In 1 Enoch they are explicitly called Nephilim, and then further labelled giants, who devour human food, then humans themselves, and finally turn on each other. Their size is less important than their insatiability. They are embodiments of excess, too large, too hungry, too powerful for a world meant to be balanced. In this expanded telling, the flood is not just about general human wickedness. It is also a targeted response to the chaos unleashed by the Watchers and their offspring. God commands the archangels to bind the rebel Watchers in underground prisons and to ensure that their monstrous children are destroyed. But even here, the story leaves a residue. The spirits of the slain giants, 1 Enoch says, become wandering, harmful entities on the earth. You can hear, beneath all this, the same themes that pulse in the Sumerian traditions, a higher order of beings crossing into the human sphere, knowledge and power descending from elsewhere, hybrid offspring who are mighty, famous, and dangerous. A flood or great catastrophe that marks a boundary between those days and the more ordinary time that follows. Later Jewish and Christian readers did not all accept 1 Enoch as authoritative, but its picture of the Watchers seeped into prayers, commentaries, and imagination. By the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, some communities were copying Enochic texts lovingly, treating them as keys to the mysteries behind Genesis' brief lines. And through it all, the core elements stayed remarkably consistent. enigmatic sons of God, human women and children remembered as extraordinary, the Nephilim, mighty men of old. How to interpret those sons of God, and what exactly the Nephilim were meant to be, became a debate that would stretch across centuries. Later theologians, rabbis and church fathers would offer very different readings of the same few words. Some would follow the Watcher tradition, others would push in completely different directions. We'll move into those competing interpretations next. Once later interpreters turned to those few verses in Genesis 6, the first big question was almost inevitable. Who exactly are these sons of God? One option, the one most closely aligned with 1 Enoch, is to say they're angelic beings. This reading was widespread in parts of early Judaism and in many early Christian circles. It takes the phrase sons of God literally as heavenly entities, members of a divine council, crossing a line they were never meant to cross. In this view, the story becomes one of cosmic disorder. Angels designed to mediate between God and the world decide to sample the pleasures of flesh and time. Their union with human women produces offspring that are, by definition, out of place. Not fully heavenly, not fully earthly, too powerful to fit quietly into ordinary human society, too embodied to return to their former purity. People who favour this interpretation often point to other biblical passages that use similar language. In the book of Job, for example, sons of God appear as beings presenting themselves before the Lord in a heavenly court. In some of the Psalms, a divine assembly of heavenly beings is implied. Genesis 6, under this lens, is a brief oblique reference to a rebellion within that council. The appeal of this reading lies partly in its drama. It paints pre-flood history as an era when the boundary between heaven and earth was thin, when the unseen world could manifest in visible form. It also ties neatly into a broader pattern, divine beings stepping down, giving forbidden knowledge, and being punished for overreach. The Nephilim here are living symbols of that boundary violation. But over time, not everyone was comfortable with the idea of angels having physical bodies and sexual desire. As Jewish and Christian theology developed, many thinkers wanted a more clear-cut distinction between spiritual beings and human flesh. That's where another interpretation began to rise. In this second approach, the sons of God are not angels at all, but human males from a particular elevated group. Sometimes they're read as kings, sometimes as aristocrats or warrior elites, sometimes more abstractly, as members of a line especially associated with God. Already in some early Jewish writings you start to see this shift. By late antiquity, several influential Christian theologians like Augustine of Hippo argued that the sons of God in Genesis 6 were the descendants of Seth, Adam's third son, who is portrayed in some traditions as the ancestor of a more righteous line. The daughters of men in this telling belong to the line of Cain, the murderer brother. The story then becomes a moral warning. The godly line corrupts itself by marrying outside its spiritual boundaries. Other interpreters, especially in the ancient Near Eastern context, went more political. They noticed that in surrounding cultures, kings were often described in semi-divine language: son of God, image of God, beloved of the gods. Pharaohs, Mesopotamian rulers, later Hellenistic and Roman emperors all wrapped their power in divine parentage. Read against that background, Genesis 6 can sound like a critique of royal excess. The sons of God are human rulers who behave as if they are above ordinary moral constraints, taking whomever they choose as wives or concubines. The Nephilim then become not literal hybrids, but the warrior aristocracy that emerges from generations of dynastic intermarriage and conquest. Mighty men of old, men of renown, begins to sound like a standard description of legendary heroes and ruling houses. In this socio-political interpretation, the passage isn't so much about metaphysical genetics as it is about power. Royal lines that claim divine sanction, accumulate wives, build reputations for ferocity in battle, and eventually draw a divine response. The shortening of human life, the coming flood, these rid as reactions to the violence and hubris of an elite class that sees itself as godlike. A third layer of reading sits somewhere between myth and metaphor. Here, the sons of God and the Nephilim are taken as symbolic ways of talking about the mixing of categories that should remain distinct. Not necessarily angels, not necessarily specific kings, but a remembered time when boundaries between sacred and profane, between clan and clan, between ruler and ruled, were far more fluid. In this more metaphorical frame, the unions of Genesis 6 preserve a memory of early experiments in social hierarchy and dynastic politics. Imagine small kin-based societies beginning to coalesce into larger structures. Charismatic leaders claiming special connection to the divine. Marriage alliances used to bind clans together under emerging chieftains. Stories arise to explain why certain families seem larger than life, why some lineages stand apart, why others fear them like grasshoppers before giants. The language of sons of God and Nephilim could then function as a way of mapping that social reality onto a cosmic canvas. Power is literalized as size. Reputation becomes renown. The terror of facing a well-armed, well-organized war band from a dominant clan is distilled into the image of towering figures whose very presence makes ordinary people feel small. What's striking is that all three major interpretations, angelic, royal, and metaphorical dynastic, end up circling around the same core themes. A crossing of boundaries, an infusion of extraordinary power into human affairs, the rise of a class of beings remembered as exceptional, taller, stronger, more dangerous, more famous than the rest. When you place Genesis alongside other ancient traditions, the pattern sharpens. The Sumerians speak of semi-divine kings before the flood. Greek myths are filled with demigods, children of gods and mortals, whose exploits belong to a heroic age different from ordinary time. Egyptian and Mesopotamian rulers trace their descent from deities or star beings. In each case, genealogies become the medium for talking about contact between the human and the more than human. The Nephilim passage in Genesis is like a compressed node in that wider web. The biblical editors kept just enough of the older material to acknowledge that such stories existed, but they wrapped them in a framework that emphasizes divine judgment and the establishment of limits. Whatever was happening in those days, it was not to be repeated without consequence. Later readers, whether they leaned toward angelic rebellions, royal critiques, or symbolic social memories, were all grappling with the same intuition, that somewhere back in the haze of prehistory, human bloodlines were touched, or thought to be touched, by something beyond the ordinary, that some families carried stories of origins that blurred the line between earth and heaven. As we move to other cultures and their own accounts of half-divine heroes and prehistoric dynasties, that intuition will keep resurfacing. Different names, different gods, different landscapes, but the same strange idea that the roots of human power run deeper than simple biology, reaching into a time when the children of heaven and the daughters of earth shared the same world. 3 Greek demigod lineages. Heracles and the heroic age in the Greek world, that same intuition takes a very specific shape. Power and strangeness don't just float in from heaven for a moment and vanish. They get written into family trees. Greek myth is obsessed with genealogy. Not just in a casual way, but with a kind of careful, almost bureaucratic intensity. Poets and storytellers keep track of who begot whom, which god lay with which mortal, which grandson inherited which curse or blessing, how one house branches into another. and at the center of those tangled branches sit the Olympian gods. If you imagined the Greek cosmos as a vast family diagram, Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Apollo, and the rest form the top tier of a sprawling aristocracy. Below them are mortals. But between those layers, binding them together, stand the heroes, figures who are neither fully god nor fully human, but some mixture of both. In Greek stories, that mixture is almost always described in the language of blood and birth. A hero in the strict ancient sense is not just a brave person. A hero is someone with an unusual pedigree. Often one parent is divine and the other human. Or perhaps a grandparent is divine. Or the family line passes through several unions between gods and mortals over generations, diluting the divine blood but never losing it entirely. Zeus is the most prolific here. In myth after myth, he fathers children with mortal women and sometimes with mortal men's wives under various disguises, a shower of gold, a swan, a bull, an anonymous stranger. Each of those unions produces a particular hero, and each hero anchors a cluster of stories, cults, and local identities. Perseus, born of Zeus and Danae, Helen and the Dios Curie, from Zeus and Leda. Minos, Sarpedon, Rhadamanthys, from Zeus and Europa. In every case, the genealogy is made explicit. The storyteller pauses long enough to say who the parents were, and often who the grandparents and great-grandparents were, before the adventure even begins. This isn't just narrative decoration, it's a way of answering a question. Why is this person so different from everyone else? The answer, again and again, is because a god is in their blood. Sometimes the divine link is more distant. Heroes like Achilles trace their lineage through a sea goddess mother, Thetis, who herself is part of a larger divine clan. The blood may be 1/4 or 1/8 divine, but it is still enough to mark them off as something other than ordinary humans, stronger, more beautiful, more tragic, capable of feats and of sufferings that would crush anyone else. The Greeks gave a name to the period when these figures were said to walk the earth. They called it the heroic age. In their own mental timeline, this age sits between the time of the gods alone and the time of ordinary mortals. First, the gods fight their cosmic battles, overthrowing older powers like the Titans and establishing order on Olympus. Then comes a long era in which the gods still intervene directly, taking lovers, siring children, shaping lineages. Their hybrid descendants fill the world with extraordinary deeds, founding cities, slaying monsters, sailing to the edges of the mapped sea. Only after that age burns itself out do we arrive at something recognizably human, the world of classical Greece and its historians. Ancient listeners would have recognized this structure at once. It's not unlike the mighty men of old, men of renown in Genesis, or the semi-divine kings of Mesopotamia. A middle era when the boundary between divine and human is especially porous, and the key actors are the offspring of that crossing. Among all these Greek heroes, one figure became the template for what half-divine life looks like: Heracles. In later Roman tradition he's called Hercules. But for the Greeks, Heracles is the archetypal demigod. He is explicitly the son of Zeus and a mortal woman, Alcmene. That parentage is never ambiguous, never metaphorical. Zeus desires Alcmene, disguises himself as her husband, and from that deception, Heracles is conceived. The story begins then with a violation of boundaries. A god takes on another man's form, enters a mortal woman's bed, and leaves behind a child who is both more and less than either parent. From the start, Heracles embodies the double edge of divine ancestry. On one side he carries immense power. In tale after tale he performs labours that no normal person could survive. Wrestling lions, dragging monstrous hounds from the underworld, holding up the sky for a titan, cleaning out stables that symbolize the filth of an entire region in a single day. His strength, endurance, and resilience are all described as superhuman, the direct result of Zeus's blood. On the other side, that same lineage paints a target on his back. Hera, Zeus's wife and queen of the gods, is consumed with rage at his infidelities and the children they produce. Her hostility to Heracles is one of the defining features of his story. She sends serpents to kill him in the cradle. Later, she inflicts madness on him, leading him to commit a terrible crime against his own family. That crime in turn sets the stage for his famous 12 labours, a long grinding series of ordeals imposed as both punishment and purification. So Heracles' divine parentage does not spare him suffering, it guarantees it. This is one of the core patterns in Greek demigod stories. Being born of a god does not mean you skip the hard parts of being human. It usually means you endure them in magnified form. Heroes bleed more, lose more, love more intensely, fall from greater heights. Their ties to Olympus do not come in the form of calm, gentle guidance, but as storms of passion, jealousy, and fate that sweep through their lives. Heracles is also relentlessly mortal in his body. He gets hungry, exhausted, wounded. He feels fear, rage, grief. Unlike the Olympians, he ages. Unlike the gods, he can die, and eventually he does, in a way that fuses the human and divine aspects of his nature in a single dramatic ending. In him, Greek myth works out what it means to be a walking intersection of worlds. A man who carries god blood in his veins but lives under the same sun, endures the same cold nights, and faces the same ultimate limit as every other human, death. As we follow Heracles through his life, his genealogy is never far from view. His status as son of Zeus shapes how kings treat him, how enemies fear him, how ordinary people talk about him. It explains why he is trusted with impossible tasks and why he is blamed when things go wrong. And it offers a model for countless other stories where a family can point back, through a chain of parents and grandparents, to some shining figure on Olympus and say, that is where our strangeness comes from. In the next part of this section, we'll watch how Greek storytellers take those half-divine figures and weave them into the political and cultural fabric of the Greek world, turning mythic pedigrees into claims about real cities, real dynasties, and real power. To see what that looks like on the ground, we have to shift from individual heroes to the places that claim them. Because in Greece, a hero is almost never just a wandering strongman or a lonely archer on a hill. He is also, very quickly, an ancestor, a founder, the root of a tribe, a city, a royal house. This is where the genealogical obsession of Greek myth starts to blur into politics. Take Heracles himself. In the stories, he roams all over the map, performing labours from one end of the Greek world to the other. But if you step back and look at how later Greeks talked about him, you notice something interesting. He becomes less a solitary figure and more the head of a sprawling clan. His sons and grandsons, the Heraclidae, literally the descendants of Heracles, are said to survive him and scatter. Some are driven out, some return, some found new homes. Centuries later, real ruling families in places like Sparta, Argos and Macedon would point to those mythic offspring and say, in effect, that's us. In Spartan tradition, the twin royal houses, the Agiads and the Eurypontids, both trace their lineages back to Heracles. They are different branches of the same heroic stock. Their right to rule, their claim to be more than ordinary citizens in a city that prided itself on equality among warriors, is grounded not in some legal document, but in a story about who their many times great-grandfather was. The story goes like this. After many wanderings and struggles, the descendants of Heracles reclaim the Peloponnese in an event later Greeks call the Return of the Heraclidae. Whether this describes an actual migration or is purely mythic is a separate question. What matters for our theme is that it provides an origin story. It says, "This land belongs to us because our ancestor, marked with divine blood, was destined to have it." We are simply fulfilling that destiny. You see versions of this pattern everywhere. Athens, for example, weaves its identity around Theseus. He is not just a monster slayer who defeats the Minotaur. He is also a synoikistes, a unifier of communities. Later Athenians say that Theseus took scattered villages and fused them into a single political body, the polis of Athens. Their democracy, their festivals, even some of their legal customs are, in story, traced back to him. When Athenians sit in assembly, they can imagine themselves as the heirs of a hero who mixed divine and human ancestry and who organized the city. Their institutions are not just practical arrangements, they are, in a sense, the unfolding of a heroic bloodline's character. Over in Thebes, another pattern. The city is bound to the family of Cadmus and Harmonia, and later to Oedipus and his cursed house. Thebes is not just a dot on a map, it is the stage on which a particular lineage plays out its fate. Plague, civil war, invasion, these political traumas get framed as the working out of a family story that goes back to a foreign founder and the gods who favoured and punished him. Argos connects itself to Perseus, Corinth to Sisyphus and Bellerophon, Mycenae to Atreus and his sons, Agamemnon and Menelaus. Each polis has its preferred hero, and therefore its preferred slice of the heroic family tree. The genealogies are doing double duty here. On one level, they are entertainment. Tales to tell at festivals, poems to recite, stories to lull children to sleep. On another level, they are charters. They tell you who belongs where, why a certain dynasty holds power, why one city can claim precedence over another at a pan-Hellenic gathering. If your king, or your founding oikist, can be slotted into the great diagram that connects back to Zeus or Poseidon or Apollo, your community gains a kind of mythic legitimacy. This is especially clear when new or upstart powers seek a place at the table. The Macedonian royal house, for instance, in the centuries before Alexander the Great, makes a point of tracing its origins to Heracles. By the time Alexander strides into history, he is not just a talented general. He is, in his own propaganda and in the stories told about him, one more link in the Heraclean chain. His campaigns into Asia are framed as a kind of sequel to Heracles' labours, another descendant of Zeus, pushing to the edges of the world. Behind that you can feel an old impulse at work, the same impulse that led Sumerian kings to list antediluvian rulers of impossible ages, or biblical authors to connect local chieftains back to the sons of Noah. The Greeks are doing it with more names, more detail, more tangled branches, but the logic is familiar. Power feels more stable when it can be anchored in a time before ordinary history. A city feels more real, more inevitable, when it can say, "We weren't just founded by some pragmatic colonist. We were founded by the grandson of a god." This divine heroic ancestry doesn't only structure politics, it also shapes geography and cult. All across the Greek world, heroes have tombs and shrines. Local communities venerate them as protective ancestors, intermediaries between gods and humans. Before a battle, a city might sacrifice not just to Ares or Athena, but to a particular hero whose bones, they believe, lie under a mound nearby and whose descendants still live among them. Those descendants, of course, are the local elite. So mythic bloodlines become part of ritual life. Festivals celebrating a city's founder reinforce the status of the families who claim descent from him. processions retracing a hero's legendary journey across a region stitch scattered towns into a single imagined kin group. And over time, as poets like Homer and Hesiod weave all these local stories together, something even larger emerges. The heroic age solidifies into a kind of shared atlas of ancestry. Different cities, different dynasties, different clans, all tucked into a single narrative web that stretches from Olympus down through the halls of kings and out into the everyday life of farmers and sailors. From our vantage point, far removed and half asleep, that web feels strangely familiar. Semi-divine rulers in Mesopotamia, the sons of God and daughters of men in Genesis, solar and lunar dynasties in India, dragon-blooded emperors in China. Everywhere, cultures seem to reach for the same solution: bridge the gap between the human now and a more than human then by drawing a line of descent. In Greece, that bridge takes the form of Heracles and his peers, stamped into the imagined genealogies of real cities and real dynasties. A reminder that for ancient peoples, questions about who we are and who should rule were almost always answered by telling a story about who or what our ancestors had been. 4. Egypt's followers of Horus and the pre-dynastic rulers. If the Greek world gives us a sprawling, many-branched family tree of heroes and cities, Egypt gives us something that feels, at first glance, much simpler and more vertical. Not a web of cousins and rival founders, but a single unbroken column of kings. At least that's how the Egyptians like to present it. On temple walls and papyrus lists, a line of rulers stretches back, not just a few centuries, but into a hazy golden age before the first historical dynasty we can date with any confidence. And near the shadowy top of that list, hovering between gods and humans, we meet a group of beings with a curious title, the Shemsu Hor, usually translated as the Followers of Horus. If Greek myths are fond of telling you in great detail who begat whom, Egyptian tradition often starts further back and higher up, with gods who ruled the land directly. In later priestly accounts, creation unfolds, the first gods appear, and then at some point the gods themselves become kings. Atum, or Ra, or Ptah, depending on the city telling the story. Then Shu and Tefnut, Geb and Nut, Osiris and Isis, Seth and Nephthys. A sequence known to modern scholars as the reign of the gods. Only after this divine kingship do we start to see more ambiguous figures. Not fully gods, but not quite ordinary humans either. Transitional rulers, semi-divine beings, and among them, in certain king lists and later compilations, the Shemsu Hor. Our main window into this imagined deep past is a damaged papyrus from the Ramesside period, usually called the Turin Royal Canon. It tries to catalogue the rulers of Egypt from the First Dynasty, all the way back into mythic time. Alongside it we have older monuments like the Palermo stone, with carved year registers naming kings and major events. These documents don't agree in every detail, but they share a striking structure. First, the gods themselves reign for impossibly long periods. Then come mysterious beings with titles like spirits or glorious ones, and then in some versions the Shemsu Hor, followers of Horus, who rule in a sequence before the first fully human pharaohs of Dynasty 1, the kings whose tombs we can actually excavate. The name itself is telling. They are not called sons of Horus or priests of Horus, but followers. That could mean ritual attendants. It could mean a warrior retinue. It could mean a sacred company that moved with the falcon god across the land. Later Egyptian texts sometimes use followers of Horus in a more everyday way to mean Horus's troops or his partisans in the mythic struggle against Seth. So when a king list applies that same phrase to a whole series of pre-dynastic rulers, we are probably looking at an old mythic category that has been formalized into a pseudo-historical sequence. In other words, a bloodline. Not necessarily in the genetic sense we think of today, but in the sense of a continuous bearer, of a particular divine charge. A line of beings whose authority, whatever else it depended on, was anchored in their relationship to a god. For Egyptian thought, that relationship is central. From the very beginning of the historical record, Pharaoh is not just a political title. It is a theological status. The king is the good god, the living Horus, son of Ra. When a new ruler is enthroned, he takes on a Horus name, written inside a serek with a falcon perched above it. In inscriptions, the king speaks as Horus, or as the son of Horus, depending on the context. To rule Egypt is to plug yourself into that falcon lineage. So when the priests of a later age look back and imagine what came before Menes, or Nama, or whoever actually unified the two lands, they do not picture a random assortment of tribal chieftains jostling for power. They imagine instead an earlier phase of the same sacred office, a pre-dynastic core of Horus kings and their companions, extending the divine kingship principle backward into prehistory. The Shemsu Hor, in this light, become an elegant solution to a conceptual problem. If Horus is both a cosmic god and the archetype of kingship, and if every pharaoh is in some way a Horus, what about the time before the first named king we know? Did Horus's line simply begin at that moment, or did it continue from an earlier world? By inserting a roster of followers of Horus before the historical dynasties, Egyptian tradition can say, no, the kingship did not start with us. It is older than our cities, older than our temples, older even than the writing we are using to carve these lists. The throne has always belonged to Horus, and humans only ever occupy it as his representatives, his embodiments, his heirs. This is where the concept of divine kingship in Egypt becomes something more than flattery. The king's body is treated as a sacred object. His blood is not just personal, it is dynastic, carrying the Ka, the vital essence of the royal line. In rituals, that Ka passes from one king to the next at coronation, as if a single ancient life force were being poured into a new vessel. When texts speak of the king forever, they do not simply mean that a particular man will live forever. They mean that the office, the living Horus, persists uninterrupted through death and succession, as a kind of immortal strand. In that sense, the Egyptian royal house is imagined less as a family tree branching out, and more as a single vertical beam, running from the age of the gods down through the Shemsu Hor into the known pharaohs of history. Individual kings can fight, usurp, even erase each other's names. But the underlying line, the sacred blood of Horus, is supposed to be continuous. Even newcomers, generals, priests, provincial strongmen must, at their accession, be woven back into that line. Their legitimacy depends on it. In later inscriptions, we sometimes see this spelled out explicitly. A king will claim that he was chosen by Horus, or begotten by Ra, even when everyone knows his human parents were not of the previous royal house. The mythic genealogy overrides the biological one. The story rewrites the blood. When Egyptian priests then look back and speak casually of kings before the two lands were united, or of the followers of Horus who ruled in the time of the gods, they are extending this logic to its furthest limit. All true kings, by definition, must belong to the same sacred lineage. Therefore, any remembered or imagined rulers before the dynasties must, in some way, be Horus people too. That way of thinking leaves its fingerprints on the sources. The Turin canon gives fantastically long reigns to these early rulers. The numbers are not meant to be audited. They are expressions of qualitative distance. The further back you go, the more godlike and vast the kingship appears. By the time you reach the Shemsu Hor, you are already half out of human time and half into mythic eternity. And yet the very act of listing them, of counting their years and placing them in order, drags them a little closer to earth. It hints that however exalted they might once have walked the same Nile banks, ruled the same floodplain, contended over the same sacred cities that later pharaohs would fight to control. What, if anything, lies behind that hint? What the Shemsu-Hor might have been, and how this notion of a pre-dynastic Horus line intersects with archaeology and later speculation, is where the story turns next. When modern historians and archaeologists sit down with those priestly lists, that's the fault line they argue over. Are we looking at pure theology, a carefully constructed ladder of names designed to express ideas about kingship and divinity? Or are we just maybe looking at a blurred reflection of something that once happened in the Nile Valley, long before writing, long before pyramids, long before Egypt as we think of it existed? The archaeological record for the centuries before the First Dynasty is no longer empty. Excavations in Upper Egypt have uncovered cemeteries and settlements belonging to cultures like Naqada I-2, I-3. We see regional elites emerging, grave goods becoming richer, symbolic objects clustering in certain burial grounds. Ivory tags with proto-hieroglyphic marks, pottery bearing signs that look a little like later royal motifs. By the late pre-dynastic period, in places like Abydos and Hierakonpolis, we even find what looks suspiciously like royal tombs before official kingship. Massive underground structures, surrounded by subsidiary burials that might represent retainers sacrificed or buried in service. Ceremonial maces and palettes depicting victorious rulers wearing the white crown of the south, smiting enemies, overseeing ritual processions. To an archaeologist, this is the slow coalescing of statehood. Local chiefs becoming proto-kings, competing for prestige, building cult centers and burial complexes to anchor their power in death as well as life. To a priest writing in Thebes 1500 years later, this may have felt like something else. A dimly remembered age of powerful figures, clustered especially in the south, associated with the falcon standard, the white crown, and early forms of the Horus name. A time when followers of the falcon were not yet pharaohs in the full sense, but already something more than ordinary people. Some scholars have suggested that the Shemsu-Hor might encode the memory of a particular regional elite from Upper Egypt that eventually supplied the model for later kingship. Others think the term could remember a priestly or military order attached to the early Horus temples, whose existence was later stretched backward into mythic time. We don't have to decide between myth and memory as if they were mutually exclusive. In many traditions, the deeper you go into the past, the more the two intertwine. It's entirely plausible that by the New Kingdom, when texts like the Turin Canon were composed, Egyptian priests had access to temple archives, local legends and very old place names hinting at pre-unification rulers. Names of powerful ancestors associated with certain shrines, certain burial grounds, certain stretches of riverbank. Faced with this patchwork, they did what priests everywhere tend to do. They organized. They took scattered memories, theological speculations and regional traditions, and they threaded them onto a single string, Horus. The result is a list that feels both grandly schematic and oddly specific. A finite number of followers of Horus, reigning for implausibly long spans, yet somehow squeezed into an order that makes sense only within Egyptian sacred history. That's why the debates today can sound so polarized. There are those who argue that the Shemsu-Hor are nothing but a theological fiction created to backfill the concept of eternal kingship. For them, the followers are no more historical than the reign of Osiris. At the other end of the spectrum, more speculative writers have imagined an advanced lost civilization, a brotherhood of sky gods or star kings ruling Egypt tens of thousands of years before agriculture. They look at the enormous numbers in the king lists and take them at face value, reading them as literal chronologies of non-human dynasties. Most academic Egyptologists occupy a quieter middle ground. They tend to see the Shemsu-Hor as mythic constructs, yes, but mythic constructs that probably crystallized around some kind of historical kernel, real pre-dynastic elites, real cult groups tied to early Horus worship, real memories of conflict and unification along the Nile. In that view, the followers of Horus aren't aliens or immortals, but neither are they arbitrary names plucked from thin air. They are what happens when a culture with a strong sense of sacred time looks back beyond the reach of its own documents and tries to make the unknown past match the logic of the present. And this is where they fit into our larger story of non-human bloodlines. When a later Egyptian text calls these early rulers followers of Horus, it is not primarily making a claim about their DNA. It is making a claim about their identity. They are defined, above all, by their relationship to a divine patron. Their legitimacy comes from proximity to a god. Their titles, their years, even their existence are arranged to serve a theological pattern. In that sense, they sit very close, conceptually, to the Nephilim of Genesis, to the semi-divine kings of Sumer, to the dragon-born emperors of China. They mark a threshold zone where kings are not just people who rule, but embodiments, representatives, or companions of something more than human. Whether or not there was ever a literal clan of Horus followers ruling over pre-dynastic Egypt, the memory of such a line allowed Egyptian civilization to root its political order in a mythic prehistory. It let every later pharaoh say, in effect, "I am not the first, and I will not be the last. I stand in a line that began when gods still walked the earth." For a culture so obsessed with continuity, that was perhaps the deepest truth of all. 5. Mesopotamian Apkallu, fish-sage bloodlines and hybrid beings if the followers of Horus are remembered as falcon-linked companions of a sky god. Then in Mesopotamia we find something a little stranger, and maybe even older in feel, a line of wisdom-bearers who come out of the water. The Mesopotamians called them Apkallu in later Assyrian art. They appear as winged figures attending kings, but in the oldest traditions preserved in Sumerian and Akkadian texts, they are described as primordial sages who showed humans how to be civilized in the first place. They are not exactly kings themselves. They stand beside kings, behind them, before them, in some lists. Each of the earliest antediluvian rulers of Mesopotamia is paired with one Apkallu, a city, a king, and a single strange advisor who is half divine, or maybe more than half, who teaches that city how to function. They are said to have brought all kinds of knowledge: how to write, how to measure, how to build temples, how to organize rituals, how to read omens in the sky and in the livers of sacrificial animals, how to arrange the calendar so that human life stayed in rhythm with the heavens. In Mesopotamian terms, that is the definition of civilization. And instead of evolving gradually through trial and error over countless generations, these stories say it was taught, delivered, handed down by specific beings. The most famous is Oannes, known in Akkadian as Yuana or Adapa, in a slightly different form of the story. A creature, said later Greek writers drawing on Babylonian lore, who rose from the waters of the Persian Gulf in the earliest times. A being endowed with reason, whose whole body was that of a fish, but under the fish's head he had another head and feet like those of a man. By day he lived among humans teaching. By night he returned to the sea. For priests in Babylon, that wasn't just a vivid fairy tale. It was a way of saying that the knowledge they guarded, the rituals, the star charts, the omens, the liturgies, was not merely clever human invention. It had deeper roots. Like the Shemsu Hor, the Apkallu form a kind of mythic genealogy of expertise. You can line them up, 7 sages before the flood, sometimes more, each attached to a particular primeval king and city. In one text they are explicitly called those of human descent, the 7 brilliant purified Apkallu, who were born in the river, who ensure the correct functioning of the plans of heaven and earth. Born in the river but serving in the palace. In other words, not quite human, not quite gods, but intermediaries. The living channel through which the designs of the divine realm become workable instructions for people on the ground. This liminal status is written into their iconography. On cylinder seals and palace reliefs from the first millennium BCE, Apkallu are typically shown in two main forms. One is the bird-headed, winged figure holding a small bucket and a pine cone-shaped object, often facing a stylized sacred tree or the king himself. The other is more directly connected to the older myths, a human figure wrapped in the skin of a fish. In that second form, the human body is draped as if wearing a hooded cloak, but the cloak is a whole fish, head over the man's head, tail hanging down his back, fins turned into decorative flaps. The man's face peers out through an opening under the fish's mouth. If you just glance at it, you might say a man dressed like a fish, a priestly costume. But the texts that speak of Apkallu as fish-like sages from the deep suggest something closer to a hybrid being, a living symbol of two realms at once. Water and land, divine depth and human surface. In ritual terms, that fish garment was not just an outfit, it was a transformation. In Neo-Assyrian ritual texts, certain priests are instructed to dress in the fish cloak when performing protective ceremonies around temples, palaces, and newly completed buildings. They walk the perimeter, reciting incantations, sprinkling water from the little buckets you see in the reliefs, touching thresholds and doorways with the pine cone object as a kind of aspergillum. The point of the ritual is to install protection, to seal the structure against demons, misfortune, and disorder. And the logic seems to be, to protect a human space, you temporarily make it part of the older, deeper order. You call on the Apkallu, invoke them by name, dress your priests as them, and in doing so, you stitch the city back into that mythic age when wisdom flowed openly from the waters and nothing crucial had yet been forgotten. The fish cloak then encodes a whole world view. Fish were linked with the subterranean waters of the Apsu, the fresh primeval deep that lay beneath the earth in Mesopotamian cosmology. The Apkallu are sometimes explicitly called sages of the Apsu, counsellors of the god Enki, lord of wisdom and of the underground freshwater ocean. A human wrapped in a fish is a human wrapped in the Apsu, wrapped in divine wisdom. The protective Apkallu figures carved on the walls of Assyrian palaces are doing the same thing in stone that ritual specialists did in real time with costume and chant. They stand permanently at doorways and thresholds, facing inward and outward, forever in the act of blessing, purifying, keeping the boundary between the ordered royal world and the chaotic outside. If you think back to our earlier examples, a pattern starts to emerge. In Sumer, the Antediluvian kings have improbably long reigns and close ties to heaven. In Egypt, the followers of Horus cluster around the moment when kingship is first taking shape. In Mesopotamia, that liminal place is populated not just by divine-adjacent kings, but by an entire class of non-ordinary advisors whose very bodies express mixture. Civilization in these stories doesn't just grow, it is mediated. It is something humans have to be coached into by beings whose ancestry lies elsewhere, up in the sky, deep in the earth, or, in this case, down in the water. And in the case of the Apkallu, those mediators do not simply vanish once their initial teaching is done. Their presence lingers in lineages of priests, in ritual roles, in carved guardians, in the way certain families claim descent from sages of old. Later Mesopotamian texts start to hint that not all Apkallu were beneficent, and that their story is tied, like so many others, to a great flood and a closing of the easy road between worlds. That, though, is the other half of their tale. Those hints about a darker side begin with a subtle shift in how the Apkallu are described. In the oldest memories, they are simply wise, simply helpful, the civilizing tutors of early kings. But as the tradition develops, especially in first millennium texts, you start to see a split. Some Apkallu remain pure, tightly linked to the god Ea, guardians of divine plans. Others become problematic. One late ritual text lists several Apkallu by name, and then adds an ominous line. Some of them angered the gods by revealing too much. The idea seems to be that there is such a thing as excess wisdom in human hands. If you imagine a world where kings can summon advice from beings who understand the structure of heaven and earth, you can also imagine the temptation to use that knowledge for more than just temple calendars and irrigation schedules. Another tradition preserves this tension in a more mythic way. In one Akkadian catalogue of sages, the 7 Antediluvian Apkallu are all of human descent, but born from the river, aligned with Ea and the pristine order before the flood. After the flood, though, a new group of figures appears. They are called Apkallu too, but with a qualifier: they are of human seed, not river-born. Their divine connection is thinner, their bodies are entirely human, their specialness more like a talent inherited from distant ancestors than a living hybrid form. It is as though the pipeline has narrowed. Instead of fresh sages emerging directly from the Apsu, you now have descendants, imitators, partial bearers of the old wisdom. They serve post-Diluvian kings, they advise, they perform rituals, but they are a step removed from the primordial source. At the same time, mythic memory says that something about the time just before the flood went badly wrong. In Mesopotamian terms, this is framed not as sin in the abstract, but as a breakdown of the delicate balance between heaven, earth, and the human cities that were supposed to mirror cosmic order. The gods complain that human noise is too great, that rituals are being neglected or distorted, that kingship has drifted from its intended pattern. Some gods argue for wiping humanity out altogether. Others, like Ea, quietly work to preserve a remnant. In that atmosphere, beings who specialize in teaching humans divine secrets become ambiguous. Did they help humans live in tune with the cosmic plan? Yes. But did they also teach things that allowed humans to push beyond their assigned place? Possibly. Some late commentators make the connection explicit. They speak of Apkallu of the city who used their skills in incantation and omen reading to challenge legitimate authority, to twist rituals for private gain, to call down forces they could not fully control. It is not hard to see why temple scribes, centuries later, would look back on the flood as both a punishment and a reset. A moment when too much knowledge, spread too widely and used too selfishly, forced the gods to close the easy channels. In that light, the flood is not only about human wickedness, it is also about managing access. Before the flood, you get direct, embodied sages from the deep. After the flood, you get human lineages that remember them, and even that memory seems to be carefully controlled. One of the most famous Mesopotamian heroes, Adapa, is sometimes linked to the Apkallu tradition. In his story, he is a sage of Eridu, beloved of Ea, so talented in ritual and incantation that he can control the winds. When he angers the sky god Anu and is summoned to heaven, Ea gives him precise instructions: what to say, how to behave. Crucially, Ea tells him not to eat or drink anything offered there. Adapa obeys, and in doing so he refuses the bread and water of life. He returns to earth still mortal, still wise, still an advisor, but denied immortality. On one level, this reads like a warning tale about obedience. On another, it looks like a mythic explanation for why humans possess such elaborate ritual knowledge while remaining fundamentally cut off from the fullness of divine being. The gate to immortality is right there, but the same god who once sent sages up from the Apsu now restricts the last step. Too much closeness between human and divine realms, the story implies, is dangerous for both sides. The Apkallu as a category embody that danger. Their hybrid forms, their river births, their role as carriers of heavenly plans into earthly courts, all of that marks them as embodiments of access. When that access is beneficial, they are revered as protectors and culture bringers. When it is misused, they become suspects, even scapegoats, in a cosmic drama about overreach. Over time, you can watch the figure of the Apkallu thin out from living myth into symbol. By the Neo-Assyrian period, kings still boast of following the plans established by the Apkallu of old. But the actual sages are long gone. Their names survive in tablets, their images stand frozen in bas-relief. Their functions are carried out by human scholars trained in specialized series of texts. The mythic bloodline has become a curriculum. Priests and exorcists claim affiliation with them the way medieval scholars would later claim Aristotle as a foundational authority, not a living colleague. And yet, the old tension lingers. Protective rituals still call on the Apkallu, but always through tightly prescribed formulas. The long incantation series that scribes memorized were themselves like fences, limiting how and when divine forces could be summoned, channeled, or imitated. You can almost hear, and all the precision, a kind of cultural memory. We did this once with the gates wide open, and it ended in water. Now we do it carefully, in the larger pattern of non-human bloodlines. The Apkallu occupy a distinctive place. The Nephilim of Genesis are explicitly framed as a transgressive union that helps trigger a flood. Greek demigods, for all their heroism, often come with a streak of chaos and excess. Egyptian followers of Horus hover just behind the first human kings. The Apkallu are closer to engineers than warriors, but their story bends the same way. An early age in which humans walk alongside hybrid teachers and receive civilization as a gift. A period of overreach and corruption, where the very tools that made cities possible begin to erode the boundary between human and divine spheres. A cataclysm that narrows the channel. And then a long after-time in which memory of those fish-cloaked sages survives as lineage, as priestly titles, as carved guardians on palace walls, but not as daily companions. The bloodline remains in a diluted, humanized form. The access does not. As we move on, that rhythm of intimate contact, mixed ancestry, a crisis, and a gradual fading of direct connection will keep surfacing in other cultures' stories, each with its own symbols, but all whispering the same uneasy thought. Once, the boundary was thinner. Once, the teachers walked among us. 6. Vedic and Puranic Solar-Lunar dynasties, Suryavansha and Chandravansha. If Mesopotamia remembers its hybrid sages as a thinned-out priestly lineage, India does something slightly different. It remembers them as families, or more precisely as dynasties whose family trees run straight past history, past the first cities, past even the first humans, and hook themselves into the fabric of the sky. In the great Sanskrit epics and the later Puranas, royal genealogy isn't just background detail. It is the spine of the story. Characters don't simply arrive on stage. They descend step by step from someone who descended from someone who descended from a god, a star, a planet. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana both open their worlds this way, with long rolling lists of fathers and sons, kings and queens, each linked by name, by epithet, by remembered deed. Modern readers often skip these sections, but inside the tradition they are doing enormous work. They are telling you that the people you're about to meet are not random. They are living branches of a sacred tree. At the highest fork of that tree stand two luminous trunks, Suryavansha, the Solar Dynasty, and Chandravansha, the Lunar Dynasty. According to later Puranic compilations, Almost every important king in the epic age belongs to one or the other. Their banners, their emblems, their family rituals, even their temperaments are coloured by whether their line is said to flow from the sun or from the moon. The solar line is traced back to Surya, the sun god, often through his son Vaivasvata Manu. Manu, in turn, is the archetypal human ancestor, the one who survives a great flood with the help of a divine fish, preserving seeds and scriptures for the next cycle of time. From Manu, the genealogies branch into long sequences of kings. Names like Ikshvaku, Harishchandra, Dilipa, Raghu. Many of these figures have their own legends, but collectively they form what later tradition simply calls the Ikshvaku or Raghu line, the high road of Suryavansha. At one point down that road, much later, appears a prince named Rama. In the Ramayana, it is never enough to just call him Rama. Again and again, the text reminds you that he is Rama of the race of Raghu, Rama of the solar line, a man whose human virtues rest on a foundation of solar ancestry. His father Dasharatha rules at Ayodhya as a king, whose authority is not only political but cosmic. The sun rises each morning. The king of the solar line rules each day. One is the reflection of the other. The lunar line, Chandravansha, begins differently. Instead of travelling through a flood survivor like Manu, it runs through Soma, the moon deity, and a figure named Atri, or sometimes directly through a luminous king called Ila or Pururavas, depending on the version. Pururava's story is already halfway between myth and court romance. A human king who falls in love with the celestial Apsara Urvashi, wins her with divine help, and loses her through a broken condition. Out of that union, the tradition says, the lunar dynasty begins to take human form. From there, the Chandravansha list becomes a river of names: Nahusha, Yayati, Puru, Yadu, Bharata. Each step branches into clans, and those clans eventually crystallize into the rival houses that dominate the Mahabharata. The Kuru princes Dhritarashtra, Pandu their sons, the Kauravas and the Pandavas are explicitly presented as late-stage twigs on this lunar branch. When the Mahabharata takes time in its opening books to chant the lineage of the Kurus, it's not just indulging in nostalgia. It is reminding you that this disastrous family conflict, this world-ending war at Kurukshetra, is happening inside a line that began with the moon and with a love affair between human and celestial realms. That framing matters. To say that a king is Suryavanshi is to place him in a particular stream of time, a stream associated with constancy, radiance, a daily cycle that never fails. To say he is Chandravanshi is to place him in a different rhythm, waxing and waning, fertility and withdrawal, passion and restraint. The texts don't always spell this out as symbolism. Often they simply recite, he belonged to the lunar race. He sprang from the solar race, as if these were straightforward facts like eye colour or homeland. But underneath, the pattern is clear. The genealogies are laid out like carefully engineered bridges between heaven and earth. Each list starts in a realm that is definitely not fully human. Sun god, moon god, an archetypal flood survivor, a celestial nymph, and then walks, generation by generation, into recognizable kingship, capitals, courts, rivalries, taxes, battles. Some figures sit right on the hinge between the cosmic and the historical. King Harishchandra, for example, appears in the solar line as a ruler so devoted to truth that he loses his kingdom, sells his family, and ends up working at a cremation ground before his virtue is finally acknowledged. The story reads like a fable about Dharma, but the genealogies tag it as a real episode in the ancestral history of later solar kings. In the lunar line, King Yayati plays a similar pivot role. Cursed with premature old age, he bargains with his sons to exchange his decrepitude for their youth. Different sons refuse or accept, and those choices become mythic explanations for why some branches of the lunar dynasty prosper and others decline. By the time you reach the princes of the Mahabharata or Rama in the Ramayana, an enormous scaffolding of ancestry has been built under their feet. You are never just hearing about a man. You're hearing about a line stretching back through semi-divine lovers, ascetic sages, flood heroes, and radiating deities to the sun and moon themselves. From a distance it can look like a blur of unfamiliar names. But inside the culture that preserved them, these genealogies function almost like genetic code. They tell you who carries which fragment of cosmic inheritance, which tendencies, which obligations. They also set up one of the most distinctive features of the Vedic and Puranic worldview, the idea that human history is mapped onto the sky, that royal bloodlines are literally strands of sunlight and moonlight woven into human flesh. How that mapping was understood, what it meant for kingship, for cosmic order, for moral duty, that's where the symbolism becomes explicit. But before we get to those meanings, there's one more twist in the story of these solar and lunar lines, and it lives in the places where the two dynasties cross and blur. Those crossings are important because they quietly undermine the idea that these dynasties are rigid, separate pipelines. In the texts, marriage alliances, adoptions, curses, and blessings cause solar and lunar blood to mingle. Kings of one line take queens from the other. Children are fostered, exiled, returned. Sometimes the Puranas even disagree about which branch a particular figure belongs to. On the surface, this just looks like mythic inconsistency, the natural result of many traditions being woven together. But if you listen for the symbolism, it starts to sound like something else, almost as if the stories are saying, yes, there are solar and lunar types of power. Yes, there are bright, straight-lined rulers and changeable tidal ones. But no one on Earth is purely one or the other. The cosmos may be neatly divided, sun here, moon there, but actual human kingship is always a negotiation between those poles. That brings us to how these dynasties functioned as maps of cosmic order. In the Vedic and early Puranic imagination, the king is not just a man at the top of a pyramid. He is a moving part in the machinery of the universe. When a Suryavansha king sacrifices properly, gives gifts, protects subjects, it is said that the seasons arrive on time, the rains fall, crops ripen, and disease retreats. When he fails, the very sky seems to comment. Eclipses, droughts, comets, untimely storms, these become signs that the solar line is out of tune with its celestial prototype. The lunar dynasty works with similar logic, but its connection is to cyclical, living rhythms, fertility, cattle, herbs, menstrual cycles, tides. A well-ordered Chandravansha reign is lush. Pastures are green. Lineages are fruitful. Ritual calendars are observed so that offerings rise and fall with the phases of the moon. If that line goes wrong, if a king breaks vows, abuses power, ignores counsel, the stories say that fertility dries up. Famines appear. Women and children suffer first. The world looks as if the moon itself were waning and refusing to return. In both cases, the royal genealogy is not just a brag sheet. It is an argument. This person has been shaped for generations to plug neatly into a cosmic role. You can feel this in the way legitimacy is narrated. When a usurper appears in the Puranas, his problem is rarely just that he seized the throne by force. His problem is that he cannot convincingly recite a line back to Surya or Soma, or at least to some recognized offshoot of those primal sources. So stories work hard to either knit him into one of the great lines, revealing that he is in fact a lost son, an adopted branch, a restored heir, or they present his reign as fundamentally unstable, a deviation that will soon be corrected by fate. Legitimacy, in other words, is genealogical and cosmological at once. To rule is to be able to say, I am a continuation of this beam of light, this stream of nectar, this ritual order, and that leads directly into moral duty. In these narratives, a king's obligations are not grounded in personal preference or social contract. They are grounded in descent. If you are born of the Solar dynasty, your dharma is coloured by solar qualities: steadfastness, clarity, willingness to endure pain to uphold a vow. When Rama accepts exile without protest, the text frames it not as an arbitrary choice, but as the natural expression of a Suryavansha temperament tuned to truth like the sun to its daily course. If you are born of the lunar dynasty, your dharma is shaded by lunar traits: sensitivity, adaptability, emotional intensity, a tendency to waver and then return. The Mahabharata's heroes often agonize, doubt, change their minds, break and remake oaths. Their moral struggle is not a flaw tacked onto their genealogy, it grows out of it. The moon, after all, is not less celestial because it waxes and wanes. Its phases are part of its function. In the same way, the Chandravansha kings enact a kind of ethical drama in which error, remorse and restoration are woven directly into the fabric of their duty. Modern scholars sometimes describe this as cosmic ethics, the idea that ethics is not imposed from outside, but is built into the structure of reality itself. The sun has a way of being right. The moon has a way of being right. Human rulers, if they know their line, are supposed to echo that. Of course, historians would also point out that these stories served practical purposes. In a landscape crowded with rival clans, being able to claim descent from the solar or lunar dynasties was a powerful political tool. It tied your little kingdom to the biggest story available, made your family drama feel like a replay of epic time. Yet even if we strip away that political layer, something deeper remains. Solar and lunar ancestry turns kingship into a kind of liturgy. To sit on the throne is to step into a pattern that began before you were born and will continue after you die. Your actions are judged not only by immediate consequences, but by how faithfully they reflect the celestial rhythm you represent. And once you see that pattern, the Vedic and Puranic genealogies stop looking like dusty lists and start looking like an early attempt to solve a question every culture faces. How do you weave human power into the order of the cosmos in a way that feels meaningful, and maybe even just? In India, one answer was to say, our rulers are not just sons of men, they are heirs of the sun and the moon. Other civilizations will give different answers: dragons, feathered serpents, sky fathers and earth mothers, but the underlying move is the same. It is the move from ordinary ancestry to mythic bloodline, from a family tree to a cosmic map. And it is that move repeated in different languages and symbols around the world that will keep guiding us through the remaining bloodlines in this journey. Number 7 on our list moves us east into one of the deepest and most continuous civilizations on the planet. Chinese mythic sovereigns, Fuxi, Nüwa, and dragon ancestry. If in India kings reach up to claim the sun and the moon, in early Chinese tradition some of the most important ancestors reach sideways into the realm of serpents and dragons. The names that usually come first are Fuxi and Nüwa. In later texts they're sometimes called three sovereigns figures, sometimes paired siblings, sometimes spouses, sometimes both at once. Already you can hear that we're on mythic ground, where categories blur. But what really stands out is not just what they do, it's what they are. In the oldest depictions we have, Fuxi and Nüwa are not fully human. They're shown with human heads and torsos, but their lower bodies are long, scaled, serpent-like tails. In some images, those tails coil around each other, even knot together, like two strands of a living double helix. Later scholars will smooth this out and talk about symbolism. But imagine encountering these figures fresh, without the commentary. Your culture heroes, the ones remembered for teaching writing, marriage laws, hunting, fishing, the art of sacrifice, the ordering of the world itself, have snake bodies. They are not just wise humans exaggerated into legend. They are hybrids from the beginning. Chinese texts remember Fuxi as the one who taught people how to trap animals, how to fish with nets instead of bare hands, how to cook meat properly. Some traditions credit him with inventing the 8 trigrams, the Bagua, the abstract pattern set that later becomes central to the Book of Changes, the Yijing. Nüwa, in turn, is remembered as the shaper of humans from yellow earth, kneading mud into living beings. When the sky collapses and the world floods, an echo of those global flood motifs we've already seen, she melts down multicoloured stones to patch the heavens, cuts off the legs of a giant turtle to use as pillars, and calms the chaos. Creation of humans, repair of the dome of the sky, restoration of cosmic order. Those are not small jobs. They belong to someone who is more than human, but not entirely distant God either. Something in between. Someone whose blood runs in people, but whose body, in art and story, still remembers being serpent and dragon. The combination is striking. On the one hand, these are civilizing heroes. They teach tools, marriage, ritual, writing, the whole cluster of things that anthropologists point to when they talk about the birth of culture. On the other hand, they carry the bodies of creatures that move in water and underbrush, that shed their skins, that coil and uncoil like rivers and storms. It is as if the tradition is saying, the roots of our order lie in something older than humanity, something that comes out of earth and water and weather. Over time, this serpent imagery shades into full dragon imagery, because the Chinese dragon itself is a kind of composite being. It has the body of a snake, the antlers of a deer, the claws of an eagle, the whiskers of a catfish, the scales of a carp. It coils like mist and storms across the sky like thunder. It lives in water but commands the rain from above. So when early myth gives Fuxi and Nüwa serpent bodies, it is not far from giving them dragon bodies. Later artwork simply completes the shift. The tails become more obviously dragon-like. The scales are emphasized. The hybrid sovereigns at the root of culture slide naturally into the category of dragons. And once dragons enter the picture, the logic of ancestry takes on a new twist. In Chinese tradition, dragons are not monsters to be slain. They are auspicious, potent, morally ambivalent, but largely protective powers. They control rain and rivers. They guard treasures. They symbolize authority that is aligned with the rhythms of heaven and earth. To claim dragon ancestry isn't to admit you come from chaos. It's to say that your line is plugged directly into the forces that make crops grow and rivers flow. It is to claim that the weather itself, the clouds and thunder, are your distant kin. That is exactly what later rulers do. By the time we reach the classical and imperial periods, dragon imagery has become one of the highest prestige markers available. The emperor's throne is the dragon throne. His face is the dragon face. His robes are embroidered with 5 clawed dragons, a privilege forbidden to ordinary nobles. His sons are dragon sons. Behind this language lies a genealogy, even when it isn't spelled out. If the ruler is the dragon, and the dragon is kin to Fuxi and Nüwa, then the imperial line is not just another clan. It is an extension of those primordial hybrids who first organized the world. And this prestige doesn't only run upward toward the throne. Local lineages, village temples, and regional cults sometimes trace their founding ancestors back to dragon kings of specific rivers or lakes. A clan by the water might say, "Our first father married the daughter of the dragon king of this bay." A shrine might honour a half-human, half-dragon official who vanished into the waves and now sends rain. On the surface, these are just devotional stories, colourful ways of giving a family or a region a bit of extra dignity. But in the broader pattern we've been following, They look like another instance of the same move, ordinary human descent being braided into something non-human, something scaled, coiling, and storm-coloured. Fuxi and Nüwa stand at the head of that braid, part human and part serpent, civilizers with dragon bodies, prototypes for a whole spectrum of mixed ancestries that will run through later Chinese thought. And just as with the solar and lunar dynasties, those mixed ancestries are not purely decorative. They carry ideas about what kind of power a ruler wields, and why anyone should listen to them at all. To see how that works, we have to look more closely at what these hybrid sovereigns actually do in the myths, and how their legacy gets woven into the fabric of Chinese kingship and cosmology. When Chinese texts remember the earliest sovereigns, they almost never talk about them as mere strongmen or clever war leaders. They talk about them as people who line up heaven, earth, and human society in a single pattern. That's where Fuxi, Nüwa, and their dragonkin start to bleed into something much bigger, a way of thinking about power itself. In many of the stories, Fuxi doesn't just invent tools and fishing nets. He orders the world. He establishes the basic categories above and below, male and female ruler and ruled, sacrifice and exchange that let human beings live in something like harmony. The 8 trigrams he's said to create are a good example. They're not just fortune-telling symbols. Each trigram links bits of nature, thunder, wind, mountain, lake, with social and moral realities, the eldest son, the middle daughter, the obedient subject, the firm ruler. In other words, a pattern that starts in the sky and the weather ends in the household and the court. Nüwa's actions fit the same logic. When she repairs the broken sky, she is not only patching a hole in the roof of the universe, she is restoring the possibility for seasons to run correctly, for rivers to stay mostly in their channels, for people to plant in spring and harvest in autumn. Cosmic repair is simultaneously social repair. Later Chinese thinkers will make this absolutely explicit. They will say that a true king doesn't just control armies or collect taxes. He harmonizes with heaven. If he rules badly, the cosmos itself shows its displeasure. Eclipses, comets, untimely frost, drought, flood. If he rules well, the seasons behave, the rains come when they should, and even animals seem calmer. Under that worldview, mythic genealogy is never just about who your great-great-grandfather was. It is a test of whether your line has ever been in tune with the deep rhythms of the world. That is why those early hybrid figures fit so neatly into political thought. If your founding ancestors were already mediators between heaven and earth, snake-bodied, cloud-coiling, half-dragon beings who fixed the sky and laid out the codes of marriage and ritual, then the job of later rulers is, in theory, to continue that mediation. They are supposed to be human faces on a much older, more than human function, keeping the pattern going. Chinese political theory eventually gives this a very precise name, the mandate of heaven. The phrase itself shows up clearly in the Zhou period, around the 1st millennium BCE, but the logic behind it feels older. The idea is simple and ruthless. Heaven, that is, the cosmic order, selects a ruling house and gives it the mandate to govern. If that house rules justly, the mandate remains. If it becomes corrupt or cruel, heaven revokes the mandate and passes it to someone else. You can hear the echo of mythic ancestors in this. A dragon doesn't belong to one family forever. It coils around whoever can ride the storms correctly. So too with kingship. It is not an inborn right, it is a relationship to the larger balance. This is where genealogy and cosmology blend into statecraft. On the one hand, elites build long, careful lineage records, tracing their lines back through semi-historical sages, and sometimes all the way to sovereigns like Fuxi, Nüwa, Shennong, or the Yellow Emperor. These genealogies say, our blood has always been close to the pattern. We descend from those who taught the world how to be in order. On the other hand, the same tradition insists that if a current ruler behaves badly enough, that ancient connection is not enough to save him. Floods, famines, and rebellions will show that heaven has turned its face away. The mythic bloodline is a claim to potential harmony, not a permanent guarantee. Hybrid ancestry in this sense becomes a template for hybrid legitimacy. A ruler is human enough to understand hunger, fear, and the pain of his subjects. But through his claimed descent from dragonkin and serpent-bodied culture heroes, he is also linked to clouds and thunder, to the cycles of rain and drought, to the very architecture of the sky Nüwa once repaired. If he fulfills that double nature well, if he is both compassionate and aligned with ritual propriety, then his reign is said to bring timely wind and rain. If he fails, the same forces turn against him. Even the bureaucratic state that eventually grows up in China carries this imprint. Officials are not supposed to be mere functionaries. In ideal theory, each one is a small node of order, a person whose correct conduct helps knit together family ethics, local custom and imperial law into a single seamless field. The exam system that selects them claims to test not just knowledge of texts, but moral alignment with the classics, many of which look back to those ancient sovereigns as models. The dragon by this stage is everywhere, carved into beams of palaces, painted on ceremonial robes invoked in poems. But under the ornament, an older idea persists, one that traces back to images of coiling, intertwined tales, and to stories of a woman with a serpent body repairing the sky. Power in this imagination is never only human. It is always, in some way, borrowed from something older and wider: weather patterns, river spirits, star cycles, the memory of a world almost lost to flood. By telling themselves that their first sovereigns were part human, part dragon, the tradition builds a bridge between the chaos of nature and the strictness of law, between the shimmering unpredictability of clouds and the measured steps of ritual. And across that bridge walk the kings and emperors, the local lords and village founders, each one in their own stories, a thin thread tying their small human concerns back into the vast, scaled body of the cosmos. When you zoom out and compare this to the other bloodlines we've looked at, the sun-born kings of India, the Nephilim of Genesis, the god-sired heroes of Greece, you can see the same move in a different costume. Mythic genealogy is doing double duty. It explains where people come from, and at the same time it explains why some of them get to rule. In China, that explanation takes the form of dragons, trigrams, and sky-repairing serpent sovereigns. The names and symbols change from place to place, but the underlying pattern, the weaving together of origin, cosmos, and power, remains surprisingly familiar. 8 Mesoamerican feathered serpent bloodlines, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, if the Chinese dragon coils around kingship and cosmic order in East Asia. A very different kind of serpent spreads its wings over Mesoamerica. The next bloodline in our list belongs to the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl to the Nahua peoples of central Mexico, Kukulkan to the Maya of the Yucatan, and by other related names across the region. And just like the other figures we've been following, he is never only one thing. In some stories, Quetzalcoatl is a god, present at the creation of the world, shaping humans from bones and blood. In others, he is a culture hero, a wise priest-king who rules a city, teaches crafts, and eventually departs, promising to return. In still others, he becomes a kind of title, a role that certain rulers or high priests can step into, wrapping themselves in his plume of sacred ancestry. Feathered serpent, in this context, is not just a strange mythic animal. It is a blueprint. Think about what that body means. The serpent is a creature of the earth, of burrows, caves, stone and soil. It glides along the ground, hugs the contours of hills, disappears into the underworld. Feathers, on the other hand, belong to birds. They are symbols of sky, wind, and light. In Mesoamerican art, the most prized feathers come from bright tropical birds that live in the canopy, close to the sun. When you fuse those together, snake and bird, scales and plumage, you get a being that can travel the entire vertical universe: underworld, surface, sky, roots, soil, clouds. In a way, Quetzalcoatl Kukulkan is the axis mundi, the living world tree that connects the three layers of reality. This is not just poetry. It is a way of talking about what sacred power has to do. A ruler or a priest in these societies is not simply the person in charge of taxes or warfare. They are supposed to guarantee fertility, regulate ritual calendars, and keep the sun's journey aligned with human time. They must know when to plant, when to sacrifice, when to march, when to stay still. They sit at the crossing point between human obligations and the cycles of maize, rain, and stars. The feathered serpent makes that crossing point visible. By claiming a special relationship to Quetzalcoatl or Kukulkan, by wearing his headdress bearing his name, or tracing descent from his legendary manifestations, elites could say, in effect, we move as he moves. We bridge the same gaps. Our line is where earth and sky meet, in central Mexican traditions, especially as recorded in later Aztec sources, looking back on earlier cities like Tollan and Teotihuacan. Quetzalcoatl appears again and again as both deity and person. There is Quetzalcoatl, the primordial god, associated with wind, dawn, and knowledge, and there is Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl, often described as a historical or semi-historical priest-king of Tollan, whose very name combines a personal title, our prince, with the divine one. Already you can feel how porous the boundary is. Is Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl a human who takes on the god's mantle? A god who walks the earth as a king, a memory of multiple rulers compressed into one mythic figure. Different sources answer differently, but they all agree on the core point. The man and the god share a name, and that name carries authority. Something similar happens in the Maya world with Kukulkan. The feathered serpent appears in classic Maya art centuries before the rise of Chichen Itza, winding along temple facades and thrones, sometimes as a sky band studded with stars and celestial emblems. Later, when Chichen Itza becomes a dominant center, Kukulkan emerges not just as a god, but as the focus of courtly identity. There are indications that high-status individuals could be titled as bearers or embodiments of Kukulkan, riding his prestige the way Chinese rulers rode their dragon ancestry. Feathered serpent, in other words, is a pattern that can be worn. If you were a priest in these societies, your job description lined up almost eerily well with the attributes of this being. You had to read the movements of Venus and the sun, calculate eclipses, and interpret omens in the sky. At the same time, you were responsible for sacrifices that penetrated down into the underworld, blood offerings, burials, rituals in caves and cenotes. You moved between star charts and bones, feathered headdresses and obsidian knives. To call yourself a servant or representative of Quetzalcoatl Kukulkan was to say, I too move through all three realms. I can carry prayers upward and channel power downward. My authority comes from knowing the hidden paths that connect them. Rulers went even further. In many Mesoamerican languages, titles could stack. A king might be Holy Lord, Speaker, and also linked to a particular god. When that god is the feathered serpent, the implication is clear. The king does not simply rule a city. He stands at the spine of the world. Genealogy in this setting often takes the form of sacred naming rather than long, detailed family trees like those in China or India. But the function is comparable. A dynasty that says its founder was guided by Quetzalcoatl or that an early lord actually was Quetzalcoatl in human form, is making a claim about its blood, not necessarily in a strictly biological sense, but in a pattern sense. We are the kind of people who carry that power. Our house is coiled up inside that myth. Some rulers were said to wear regalia that literally turned their bodies into partial serpents, serpent belts, serpent masks, great collars of feathers and jade. When these appear in inscriptions alongside personal names, it's hard to tell where the human ends and the divine costume begins. And maybe that ambiguity was the point. By blurring the line, the tradition lets a living person step into a role that is older than any city and wider than any one people. The feathered serpent belongs to the whole layered cosmos, but for the duration of a reign, a particular lineage can become its favoured channel. Priestly colleges, too, traced a kind of spiritual descent from earlier feathered serpent-connected sages. Stories told of wise men who learned calendar lore from Quetzalcoatl, who received song, writing or ritual instructions directly from him. Later priests inherited these teachings, and by repeating the rituals correctly, they kept that line of transmission alive. The blood might change from generation to generation, but the lineage of knowledge, the serpent of tradition, remained unbroken. All of this makes the feathered serpent much more than a pretty motif on a temple staircase. It is a living statement about what it means to hold power and wisdom in a world where sky, earth, and underworld are constantly interacting. And as you follow this scaled, feathered ancestor through different cities and centuries, something interesting happens. The god, the title, and the symbol begin to drift, to be reinterpreted, to be claimed by new elites under new circumstances. In central Mexico, that drift shows up in the way Quetzalcoatl changes clothes as centuries pass. Early on in the shadowy memory of Teotihuacan, we don't have long written narratives. We have images and later echoes, but what we can see suggests a being strongly tied to water, fertility, and the sustaining breath of life. The feathered serpent there curls along the sides of pyramids, ringed with shell symbols and watery motifs, as if he were a river of sky flowing along the stone. By the time later Nahua storytellers look back on Teotihuacan, they'll remember it as the place where gods were made, and Quetzalcoatl becomes a figure deeply involved in cosmic sacrifice, throwing himself into a divine fire so that the sun can rise. That's a slightly different emphasis, less about irrigating fields, more about igniting the heavens. The core image is stable, but its job description is shifting. When we reach the Toltec stories of Tolan, sometimes identified with Tula, Quetzalcoatl has taken on yet another role. Now he often appears as the ascetic priest King Tepiltzin Quetzalcoatl, opposed to darker, more militaristic cults. In these tales, he forbids human sacrifice, favours offerings of birds and butterflies, and rules a city that flourishes under his wise, gentle leadership, until intrigue and sorcery drive him out. Some scholars see this as a moral drama invented centuries later, projecting Aztec debates about war and sacrifice back onto an idealized past. Others suspect there may be a dim memory of real political conflicts wrapped inside the myth. Either way, the result is that Quetzalcoatl becomes a symbol of a particular style of rulership, pious, scholarly, more associated with priests and sages than with conquering generals. Then, under the Aztec Triple Alliance centuries later, Quetzalcoatl wears still another face. In painted manuscripts and temple complexes from the Mexica capital at Tenochtitlan, he appears as a major god of wind, learning and priesthood, but now fully integrated into a state that practices large-scale human sacrifice. The earlier gentle tone is not erased, but it is subsumed into a larger pantheon where gods of war, rain, and the sun have their own insatiable demands. Here, Quetzalcoatl is closely linked to the priestly office itself, patron of the Kalmikak, the elite schools where noble youths learned ritual, astronomy and history. A priest could be a Quetzalcoatl of his temple, much as someone else might be a Huitzilopochtli in war. The feathered serpent's aura of sacred knowledge has become a professional badge. Across that arc from Teotihuacan to Toltec Tolan to Aztec Tenochtitlan, you can watch the same figure slide from watery life force to moralized king to institutional patron of scholarship and ritual. Each era keeps what it needs, lets the rest fade, and adds a new layer. Something parallel happens in the Maya world, but with its own flavors. In the Classic period, roughly the first millennium of our era, we see serpents everywhere in Maya art and writing, but not always in the specific feathered form called Kukulkan. There are vision serpents emerging from bloodletting rituals, serpent bars held by rulers, and great sky serpents whose bodies carry the sun, moon, and planets. Serpents are the highways of the gods on monuments from sites like Yaxchilan or Palenque. Kings and queens conjure these serpents from clouds of incense or from their own blood, and ancestral figures appear in the serpent's jaws. It's as if the lineage itself travels on a serpent body, linking the living ruler to the dead and to the gods above. Here, the serpent is less a single-named deity, more a general medium of connection. Later, in the post-classic period, as power centers shift northward, Kukulkan steps into sharper focus. At Chichen Itza, the feathered serpent is not only carved along stairways, but woven into the very identity of the city's ruling groups. Some inscriptions and later chronicles suggest that a prestigious group or faction claimed the name Kukulkan almost like a dynastic emblem. By this time, trade networks stretch across coasts and highlands. There are clear signs of interaction between Central Mexican and Maya elites. Feathered serpents in one region start to look suspiciously like feathered serpents in the other. Stories begin to travel with merchants, migrants, and conquerors. One fascinating pattern appears in multiple traditions: the idea of the feathered serpent arriving from the east, often by sea, and later departing again. In some Yucatec accounts, Kukulkan comes to Chichen Itza, brings new forms of ritual and rule, and then leaves, heading back toward the dawn. In Central Mexican stories, Tepiltzin Quetzalcoatl similarly departs eastward, sometimes on a raft of serpents or burning snakes, promising to return on a specific calendar day. This creates a kind of shared narrative template, a luminous culture hero tied to the feathered serpent, coming from outside, reforming a city, and then vanishing. Different peoples plug their own geography and politics into the framework. Was he originally a god, a distant foreign ruler, several chiefs blended together? The stories don't settle it. They just keep reusing the mould. When the Spanish arrive in the early 1500s, this long history of drifting meanings collides with yet another set of interpretations. Some later colonial chronicles written by Spanish friars, drawing on indigenous informants, suggest that the Mexica ruler Moctezuma II associated Hernan Cortés with the returning Quetzalcoatl. Modern historians debate how widespread or literal such beliefs really were. It's possible that a few nobles trying to make sense of overwhelming shock reached for an old story about a bearded, light-skinned figure from the east, and applied it to the strangers on horseback. It's also possible that some of these tales were amplified or reshaped to fit Christian ideas of prophecy and fulfillment. Either way, the fact that this identification could even be imagined tells us something about how flexible the feathered serpent lineage had become. It could stretch from primordial creation to foreign conquest, from divine sacrifice to Spanish armour, without completely snapping. Over more than 1,000 years, Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan shift from cosmic architect to farmer's ally to priest-king to patron of scholars to half-remembered prophecy. Yet certain threads remain. He is always a being who crosses boundaries between sky and earth, between cities and the outside world, between epochs of order and times of upheaval. Lineages that attach themselves to him claim not just prestige, but a kind of built-in adaptability. If their ancestor is the feathered serpent, then they too can shed skins, grow new feathers, survive regime changes and disasters by redefining what the myth means. And when you set this alongside the other bloodlines we've been tracing, the dragon-bodied founders of China, the solar and lunar dynasts of India, the fish sages of Mesopotamia, the Nephilim, and their hybrid heirs, you start to see a quiet pattern. Again and again, across continents, cultures imagine an inhuman ancestor who can move through more than one realm at once. Sky and earth, land and sea, human and divine. The details differ, the names change, but the core function is similar, to give later rulers and ritual specialists a story that makes their authority feel as old and as wide as the cosmos itself. In Mesoamerica, that story coils through time in the body of a snake wearing feathers. By the time we meet him in the last pre-Columbian centuries, he has already been rewritten many times. But beneath all the changes, he is still doing the same work our other mythic ancestors do, tying fragile, temporary human bloodlines to something that seems older than history and larger than any single people. And from here, as the feathered serpent glides off toward the horizon, we can follow another set of genealogies entirely, this time across the vast Pacific, where sky and earth themselves are lovers, and whole island chains trace their descent from the moment they are gently pried apart. 9. Polynesian genealogies of sky-earth unions, Rangi and Papa. Out in the Pacific, the pattern of non-human ancestry shows up in a way that's both simple and enormous. Instead of a dragon or a feathered serpent, the ancestor is the sky itself. And the earth. They are not just a backdrop where stories happen. They are parents. Your parents, 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 all the way up the line, vanish into a love story between heaven and the ground. In many Polynesian traditions, especially in Aotearoa, New Zealand, the world begins in a tight embrace. Rangi Nui, the sky father, presses down. Papatuanuku, the earth mother, lies beneath. There is no space between them, no light, no wind, no room to move. Their children are born into this darkness, crushed in the narrow gap between their parents' bodies, growing up in a kind of cosmic womb. These children are not minor spirits. They are the great departmental gods, Tane of forests, Tangaroa of the sea, Tawiramatia of winds and storms, Tumatawenga of war, and others whose spheres cover almost everything important in human life. In some tellings they whisper together in the darkness, arguing for ages about what to do. Remain in the comfort of their parents' embrace or force a separation and risk something unknown. Some propose lifting their parents apart so that light can enter. Others suggest killing them altogether. It's not a simple rebellion. It's a family debate over whether existence itself should change. Eventually, Tane lies on his back, plants his feet against Rangi, pushes with his shoulders against Papa, and forces them apart. Sky arches upward, weeping rain for his lost lover. Earth stays below, clothed in forests, by the very child who separated them. The world as we know it, space, light, wind, horizons, is born out of that painful, deliberate act. Right there, in the opening scene, genealogy and cosmology are the same thing. The shape of the universe is the shape of a family. And in Polynesian cultures, that principle doesn't stay in the distant mythical past. It filters straight down into how people think about themselves, their land, and their obligations. Across the broad triangle of the Pacific, Aotearoa, Hawaii, Rapa Nui, Tahiti, the Cook Islands, you find variations of this sky-earth origin pattern. The names change. Rangi and Papa, Wakia and Papa, Ao and Po, different pairings of sky, father and earth, mother. But again and again, the first parents are the two halves of the visible world. From them come generations of gods and forces, and eventually human ancestors, chiefs, navigators, culture heroes. That means when someone in these societies recites their lineage, they are not just listing human forebears. They are literally climbing back through winds, seas, forests, mists, and finally into the embrace of the primordial couple who are the land and the overarching sky. In Maori tradition, this recitation is called Whakapapa. The word itself hints at layers, at one thing placed upon another. It's not only a family tree, it's an ordered sequence of descent that can include mountains, rivers, canoes, stars and deities, all arranged as kin. You might stand up in a meeting house and begin with your mountain, your river, the ancestral canoe that brought your people to shore, your tribe, your sub-tribe, your family, and then your own name. For someone raised in a European genealogical mindset, that sounds like mixing metaphors. For someone steeped in Polynesian thought, it's simply accurate. The mountain is an elder, the canoe is an ancestor, the land itself is a grandparent whose body you walk upon. This is where the Sky Father and Earth Mother structure becomes more than just a creation myth. It turns genealogy into a way of navigating identity. If your iwi traces descent from a particular canoe that landed on a particular bay, then that stretch of coastline is not just real estate. It is a body part of your Earth Mother, inherited through a specific line from Rangi and Papa. Your rights to it, fishing grounds, gardens, burial places, are expressed as kinship duties. You don't just own land, you belong to it because you and it share ancestors at the very top of the family tree. The same idea shows up, with different names and details, in other corners of Polynesia. In Hawaii, for example, some genealogies trace the Ali, the chiefly lines, back to Wakia, the Sky Father, and Papa, sometimes called the Earth Mother or Foundation. Their union produces the islands themselves and later human beings. In one version, the first stillborn child of Wakia and his daughter is buried, and from that burial grows the kalo plant, taro, a staple food. The second child is the first human. From then on, people and their staple crop are literally siblings. That's not just a poetic flourish. It establishes a sacred duty. To mistreat taro, or the land that grows it, is to mistreat a brother, a cousin, an ancestor. To steward it well is to fulfill a familial responsibility laid down at the very beginning of time, when sky and earth first lay together. Genealogy in this world is also a map. It can tell you where your people came ashore, which wines your ancestors rode, which reefs you have the right to fish, which groves you should protect. It tells you who you can marry and who you must not, which lines can be joined and which would violate tapu, the sacred ordering of relationships. It tells you which rituals you are heir to, which chants you are permitted to recite, which godly forces are closer to your line because of how you branch off from Rangi and Papa, or Wakia and Papa, or their local equivalents. And because those first parents are the sky above and the earth below, every recited genealogy quietly recreates the cosmos. Gods and elements, islands and canoes, chiefs and commoners, all stacked in sequence from the first darkness to the present moment. Once you see that structure, something else becomes possible. You can use the same genealogical logic to claim, negotiate, and sometimes contest power, by positioning yourself differently along that chain from sky and earth downward. You can hear that in the way some chants arrange their lines. A chiefly genealogy might linger for a long time in the upper reaches of the cosmos, naming gods, naming personified winds and seas, before it ever gets around to naming recognizably human ancestors. That isn't just for drama. It anchors political authority in the architecture of the universe itself. A high-ranking chief is not only the great-grandchild of some famous navigator, he or she is a more direct branch off the trunk that rises from Rangi and Papa. Low-ranking people have ancestors too, but their lines often peel off later, further down the sequence of divine unions. They share the same ultimate parents, but the distance between them and the original sky-earth couple is greater. The cosmos is one tree, but not everyone is standing on the same part of the trunk. Once you notice this, the Polynesian pattern starts to look very familiar. We've seen it again and again in this journey. Sumerian kings claiming descent from the heavens through the Anunnaki, biblical texts speaking of sons of God taking human wives, Greek heroes with Zeus somewhere up their family line, Egyptian pharaohs styled as literal offspring of gods. Over and over, political and spiritual authority is explained by pointing to a bloodline that runs upward into the non-human. Polynesian traditions are doing something similar but with a different emphasis. In Mesopotamia or Egypt, the divine-human union usually takes place at the top of the royal house. A god visits a queen, a goddess favours a particular king. Legitimacy flows down a narrow channel. Most people are on the outside looking in. In the Pacific, the ultimate parents are so large, so encompassing, that no one stands outside their union. Sky and earth don't marry into a single family. They are the family. That doesn't erase hierarchy. Polynesian societies could be highly stratified, with sacred chiefs at the apex. But those chiefs don't monopolize divine ancestry. Instead, they claim a privileged position within a shared lineage. Their manner, their spiritual potency comes from being particularly close, in genealogical terms, to the great departmental gods who stand between Rangi and Papa and the human generations. It's a subtle twist on the same old theme. In one model, divinity steps down into a royal line like a lightning bolt. In the other, divinity is the weather itself, and some ridges catch more of the storm. The parallels go deeper. Think about the way Genesis compresses its pre-flood world into a handful of generations from Adam to Noah. Or the way Greek myth stacks gods, titans and mortals into intertwined family trees. Or the Chinese tales of culture heroes like Fuxi and Nüwa, part serpent, part human, arranging the cosmos and then leaving descendants who rule. All of these systems use genealogy as a bridge between the everyday and the vast. A list of names becomes a ladder you can climb, rung by rung until you pass out of ordinary time and into a mythic age when gods and forces were still taking shape. Polynesian Whakapapa does that too, but it also maps something else, the environment itself. Where a Greek might trace descent from a sea god in order to explain why a single hero can command the waves, a Polynesian recitation might literally place the reef, the lagoon, and the open ocean wind as elder siblings in your family. The result is the same genre of story. We are descended from non-human powers, but with a different moral. In many old world traditions, divine bloodlines can be used to justify dominion over land, animals and other people. We rule because our ancestor was a god. In the Polynesian frame, the same move more often implies responsibility. We must tend this bay and this forest carefully, because they and we share the same grandparents. Even the recurring motif of mixed unions appears, though in a distinctive way. In Hawaii, for instance, the relationship between Wakia and his daughter Ho'okulani, resulting in the first Taro and the first human, has echoes of those older, more troubling myths where gods take mortal or semi-mortal partners. But here, the focus isn't on the scandal, it's on the kinship web that results. The story doesn't end with the hero going off to found an empire. It ends with an injunction: treat your staple crop and your land as close relatives, because they literally arise from the same womb of sky and earth. Compare that to the Nephilim stories, where unions between sons of God and human women produce mighty men of renown and a world so corrupted it must be washed away. Or to Greek tales where god-mortal unions lead to cycles of war and tragedy. In those narratives, crossing the line between divine and human often feels dangerous, destabilizing. It creates beings too powerful, too ambiguous, to fit comfortably into ordinary society. In Polynesia, the blend is everywhere and ongoing. The line between human and non-human is porous by design. Mountains, fish, storms, crops, everything sits somewhere along the same genealogical chain. That doesn't make them tame or safe. Many beings in those chains are dangerous, taboo, requiring strict protocols. But it does make them kin. If you step back and look across all these cultures, a pattern emerges. Over and over humans reach for the same tool, genealogy, to answer the same questions. Where did we come from? Why do some rule and others follow? What is our relationship to the landscape, to animals, to the forces that can bless or destroy us? The answers vary. Sometimes the gods are distant and aloof, touching human history only through a favoured bloodline. Sometimes they are intertwined with the very ground and air, ancestors of every breath. But the structure repeats, a ladder of names, a chain of begettings. A story that begins not with anonymous matter swirling in a void, but with persons, sky and earth, god and goddess, serpent and dragon, light and darkness, joining, separating, and giving birth to everything that follows. For Polynesian navigators chanting their Waka Papa on a moonlit ocean, that structure is not abstract. It is a way of holding the world in the mind. Each ancestor is a star, a wind, a current, a remembered landfall. Each generation is a step between the human present and the non-human origins. And for us, listening from a great distance, those chants sit alongside Sumerian king lists, biblical genealogies, Greek heroic cycles, Egyptian and Chinese dynastic myths, and the feathered serpent lineages of Mesoamerica as one more version of the same deep intuition. That somewhere before there were people, before there were cities or crops or stories, there was a union between something more than human and something that would become human. That our blood is older than we are, that our family tree, if you trace it back far enough, turns into a map of the cosmos. If you let your mind drift back over the journey we've just taken, you can almost feel those different ladders of names lining up beside each other. In Sumer, antediluvian kings stretch their reigns across tens of thousands of years, anchored in the favour of the Anunnaki. In Genesis, the sons of God step across a boundary that later tradition insists should stay closed, and the Nephilim appear as a kind of warning label on mixed blood. In Greece, Zeus leaves a trail of demigods behind him, a whole heroic age built out of unions between the thundercloud and the village. Egypt gives us pharaohs whose titles insist they are literally children of gods, walking embodiments of Horus, inheritors of a throne that begins in the time before time. Mesopotamia adds its Apkallu, half-fish sages emerging from the waters to seed civilization, their wisdom passed down like a gene. India's Vedic and Puranic traditions unfold solar and lunar dynasties that treat the sun and the moon as great ancestral houses. Each generation another link between blazing light and human kings. Early China tells of Fuxi and Nüwa, serpent-bodied culture shapers, and of dragon ancestry woven into imperial claims. Mesoamerica crowns its rulers with the feathers of Quetzalcoatl and Kukulkan, serpents of sky and storm whose bloodlines run through temple staircases and royal courts. And far out in the Pacific, Polynesian genealogies answer with Rangi and Papa, with sky and earth so vast that everyone belongs to their union, from high chiefs down to the taro in the field and the fish along the reef. On the surface, these stories can feel wildly different, Fish sages are not feathered serpents. Dragons are not Apkallu. The Nephilim are not the followers of Horus. Each system grows out of a particular landscape, a particular history, a particular set of anxieties and hopes. But when you listen for the pattern, half awake, something else comes into focus. Again and again, humans explain themselves by reaching upward and outward into the non-human. Again and again, we place something otherworldly at the root of the family tree. Sometimes that otherness looks like gods with faces and voices. Sometimes it looks like dragons and serpents, or sky and earth treated as persons. Sometimes, in the cool language of modern science, it looks like an ancient population bottleneck, a narrow passage that shapes every descendant. Myth and genetics are not the same thing. We shouldn't pretend that Sumerian king lists secretly encode chromosome fusions, or that Nephilim tales are covert reports of Denisovan hybrids. But there is a resonance between them that's hard to ignore. Myths say, our blood comes from beyond the ordinary. Genetics says all of us, everywhere, share a small, improbable set of survivors, people who lived through a world that almost erased them. Myth gives that feeling a face and a story. Science gives it numbers and timelines. Both are trying in different ways to describe the same vertigo, that being human means carrying a past that is far stranger and far older than our day-to-day lives suggest. You can treat these 9 ancient non-human bloodlines as nothing more than fiction, elaborate political propaganda dressed up as sacred truth. You can also treat them as distorted memories of real upheavals, climate swings, migrations, encounters with other human species pressed into symbolic form. Or you can simply let them be what they are best at being. Invitations. Invitations to imagine ourselves as part of stories that run beyond a single lifetime, beyond a single people, beyond even the human. As you fall asleep, you might let one question follow you down into dreams. If you traced your own ancestry, not just through surnames and paper records, but back through myths and fossils and forgotten migrations, how many different kinds of non-human would you pass along the way? Gods, monsters, animals, forces, bottleneck survivors, unknown cousins who left their DNA but not their names. Our blood, whatever else it is a library of all of that. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you for keeping me company in the dark. I'd love to know where you're listening from, what coast, what city, what stretch of land has become your place in this long chain of ancestors and myths. If you'd like more slow, careful dives into deep time and old stories, you can like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe so you don't miss the next journey. And if you want to keep exploring when you're awake again, there's a book on the website about 12 prehistoric secrets that didn't make it into this episode. You'll find the link in the description. It follows some of the same threads, bottlenecks, forgotten cousins, strange turning points, into corners of the past we hardly ever talk about. For now, though, you don't need any of that. You can let the names and lineages fade, like constellations slipping below the horizon, and rest in the simple thought that you too are part of a story that began long before you were born and will keep unspooling long after. Sleep well.